Frank, I was wondering if you could take a look at these notes for this episode. What's with the tie? You've got a date tonight. Frank, you said you'd help me with this episode. You said that you would help me edit the script. And you know what? Just because you're a sentient cactus does not mean that you can avoid the work for a job you were assigned a few days ago after my bizarre neighbor pulled a theme-appropriate bring-it-to-life subplot for our first Reanimator episode. Alright, fine. Just be on time for work next Monday. I'll see you later. Sequels are hard. Crafting a sequel to any movie that is as good, if not better than the first film, is tough. Crafting a sequel that is as good, if not better than the first film, which also happens to be a cult horror film that managed to capture lightning in a bottle one time, is near impossible. Doesn't matter how good your follow-up is, people are going to be disappointed in it. Take a look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a low-budget, gritty exploitation masterpiece. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is one of the most bonkers, satirical, pop art, frenzied horror films I've ever seen, and one that I personally happen to enjoy more than the first movie, which I already hold in high regard. And yet, people out there hate it. See, it doesn't matter how different or well-crafted Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 is, it's not the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And so, people don't like it. And that's a tough uphill battle for any movie to face, and one that our movie today actually did have to face, and managed to succeed in a lot of areas. So rather than me ramble on about sequels and movie series we're not currently talking about, let's dive into today's movie, Bride of Reanimator. I'm Ryan Reed, and this is Fright Films. Bride of Reanimator is a 1990 film, this time directed by Brian Yuzna, who was the producer on the original. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint the exact year that Bride of Reanimator was released. It played at various festivals around the world until finally getting a US theatrical and video release in 1991, but we'll stick with 1990 because it was the first year it started playing at said festivals. But anyway, even though Stuart Gordon doesn't return for this film, a lot of the cast and crew do. As mentioned, Yuzna is now in the director's chair, Richard Band returns for the music, Bruce Abbott is back as Dan, and of course, Jeffrey Combs is back as everyone's favorite scientific madman, Herbert West. You know, speaking of madmen, I haven't seen my neighbor in a few days. Besides the point. Anyway, what I was trying to get at is that even though a lot of the cast and crew do return, there's something that's slightly off about Bride of Reanimator. The plot revolves around Dan and Herbert no longer just trying to reanimate the dead, but now trying to create life, using various body parts to craft the perfect woman. And that's a pretty straightforward basis for a film, if it were the only plot. Now, to kind of set things up, I do have to get into some spoilers, so if you haven't seen the original Reanimator, maybe skip to this point here. All good? Okay, so here's the thing about this movie. It asks you to forgive a lot of things in order to move the plot forward. Like, remember at the end of the first movie, the last time we see Herbert West, he's being dragged into a cloud of smoke after being attacked by Dr. Hill's intestines? Yeah, well, he's alive, and he and Dan are now working in Peru during a civil war in order to help the wounded and to continue their research. And you know what? That's a minor thing to look past. After all, we didn't actually see Herbert West die. But that's only the beginning of the questions. After the title sequence, Herbert and Dan return to the US to continue to work as doctors at the facility that they were at before in the first movie. Problem is, this movie never explains how they got their medical license. And on top of that, why would they be allowed to continue to practice at the same facility after all the insanity that happens at the end of Reanimator? Never explained. And then through a series of plot elements, Dr. Hill's severed head makes its way back to the same facility because of a police investigation. Another doctor named Dr. Graves uses some of the leftover serum to bring Dr. Hill's head back to life. But wasn't Dr. Hill's head crushed? I mean, literally crushed by the zombie Dean at the end of the first movie? Apparently it doesn't matter. They just say it was a skull fracture and we as the audience should just move on. And you know what? That stuff is fine. Is it ridiculous for us to just accept all of this? Yeah, a bit. But this is also a movie where people sew body parts together and then bring them to life using a glowing green juice, so I'll forgive them for being a little vague with the details. But then the movie throws so many subplots at us for what should be a very simple story. You've got Herbert's main story about wanting to create life. And then you've got a story of Dan being in love with a woman from the Civil War named Francesca who's come over to the U.S. And then you've got this other story of Dan maybe kind of being in love with a patient. And then you've got the story of Dr. Hill's severed head wanting to get revenge on Herbert West. And then you've got the story of the cop who's investigating the events that happened at the end of the first movie for another plot detail that I won't spoil here, and we even gotten to when the titular bride comes into the movie. It's a lot for a 96-minute runtime, and unfortunately the pace is a bit off with all of that stuff in it too. Even though it's not much longer than the first movie, Bride of Reanimator just feels a bit more sluggish until we get to the third act. And despite having a much higher budget than the first film, something about Bride of Reanimator just feels like there's this lack of balance. Like sometimes they're working with their budget and sometimes they're working completely without it. A good example of this is in the score. Although Richard Band does return, he creates some great music here. Something about it just feels less bombastic, more restrained. Like they're using cheaper instruments or instruments were less plentiful, and so it just comes off a bit, not as well polished, and it makes the movie feel less refined. Which is a shame because there is a lot to like about this movie. Yet again, Bruce Abbott and Jeffrey Combs work great together. Their polar opposite personalities just help keep moving this plot along. And Jeffrey Combs has some great lines and line deliveries. He just sells the absurdity so much. And you know what? The script is actually pretty good too, despite reportedly having to be finalized in under a month. But I will say it does lean a bit too much into the humorous elements for me. The first film was that perfect balance of horror and comedy. And here, everything just feels oddly lighter in tone despite having the same kind of violence that the first movie does. It's almost like if you know somebody who's maybe a bit too squeamish for Reanimator, I think you could probably show them Bride of Reanimator and kind of see if they want to step foot into the insanity of this world. The special effects are also great here. Pretty much every major effect was done by somebody different. Screaming Mad George, John Carl Buechler, K&B Effects Group, they all contribute something here. And instead of getting varied FX qualities, they all bring their A game and it works tremendously. And the third act also kicks everything up a notch. It is so wonderfully crafted that it makes me wonder why the rest of the film isn't quite as polished. Here, the jokes land, the tension is pushed to an insane level, the horror and the humor blend, all the gore effects come to a head, literally in Dr. Hill's case, and the conclusion leaves audiences satisfied like the last leg of a roller coaster. It makes any faults in the rest of the movie worth it just to get here. While the flaws did stand out to me more in Bride of Reanimator than Reanimator, it is in no way a bad film. In fact, it's an absolutely worthy follow-up to the original. Is it as good? Well, I think that's a matter of taste. It's different while still functioning in the same universe, and overall it's just super enjoyable. And that's what a movie is meant to be. So, if you've seen the first film but haven't checked out the sequel, now is as good a time as any to check out Bride of Reanimator. I'm Ryan Reed. Go watch a movie.